Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, Euronews' talk show all about the European capital of Brussels. On Brussels, my love, we break down the big stories of the week, examine what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, EU foreign ministers met in Brussels, signed off on fresh sanctions against Iran targeted at those responsible for the repression, but stopped short at blacklisting the Iran Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist group, with a new European Parliament report warning that authoritarianism is on the rise around the world and human rights violations are seriously threatening the global rules-based order. We're asking if anyone really cares out there about human rights or if economic interests will always win over. And 2 million, the number of people who took to the streets recently in France to protest against the French government's plans to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. The French President Emmanuel Macron seems stuck between a rock and a hard place, with polls saying the majority of the country from the far right to the far left in France are vehemently against his pension reform. With Europe facing an ageing population and a low birth rate, we take a picture of retirement across the EU and see what's at stake for the old continent. To talk about these stories and more, I'm joined here in our studio by Abir El-Sehlani, the Iraqi-born Swedish MEP, representing the Renew Europe group. That's the group affiliated with the European Liberal Democrats. We're also joined by Elizabeth Kuipper, the Associate Director at the European Policy Centre, a think tank here in the city. And Teresa Kuschlech, a Swedish journalist and analyst with Svenska Dagbladet, a Swedish daily. Thank you so much, ladies, for being with us here. Before we get your insights, let's just get you up to speed on what exactly is at stake here. Christopher Pitchers reports.
The European Union often touts itself as a champion of human rights, condemning those who fail to live up to its high standards. Just this week, the EU slapped fresh sanctions on 35 Iranian officials and organisations, blaming them for the country's brutal crackdown on protesters and other human rights abuses. But critics argue that Brussels' economic interests sometimes outweigh its determination on human rights. Qatar is one of these. Before a corruption scandal allegedly involving it engulfed the European Parliament, people from the Gulf state were set to benefit from visa-free travel in the EU for up to 90 days. This was despite its poor record on labour rights and working conditions, which saw migrant workers die in the build-up to the FIFA World Cup last year. Morocco is another of these countries, also caught up in the same corruption allegations. Until last week, the European Parliament hadn't condemned it for 25 years, even if its track record on imprisoning journalists isn't great. But while there are arguments that Brussels' pressure on human rights has caused some countries to change course, is it a matter of double standards for the EU when the pros outweigh the cons?
Christopher Pitchers there asking if it's a matter of double standards for the EU. So the big question, does the EU really care about human rights? So let's start with you, Abir, as a member of the European Parliament, where you're sitting, mingling every day with members of the European Parliament. What would you say to that?
Of course we do, and we do it every day, and we do it honestly and truthfully. The thing is that we are not the only co-legislators here. I mean, it's not only us who legislate, but also the Commission and the Council, where often things are blocked, to be honest, when the national government gather to make decisions about the EU. And the second thing is how we make decisions on foreign affairs in the EU. I mean, we do not have legislative competence when it comes to foreign affairs. It's still a national competence. So that issue, for us as MEPs, as directly elected members of the Parliament, of our voters, our citizens, is giving us headache because we feel the pressure and we know that our citizens want us to stand up for human rights, basic values that our union is based on, not only within the European Union, but also outside globally.
And Elizabeth Kuipper, from where you're sitting there, representing the European Policy Centre, an economic think tank, a political think tank, but also human rights, an issue of importance for you. What would your take be on that question?
Well, human rights is very important. I think it always has been for the EU, but I think you often see that the EU is driven by short-termism. So clearly there's double standards. There's short-term concerns, for example, to do with migration or security issues, more recently energy dependency. And I think therefore it's important that the EU looks for a much longer-term vision. And I think you see that the EU is trying to do that. And certainly, for example, when it comes to China, who's certainly buying also its impact in regions like Africa, the Global South, it's important that we do not only care about our own concerns, be it, again, economic or driven by migration, but we have a vision, not just for Europe, but also for the region. And I think that is really important, that it's a reciprocal vision.
And Teresa, what about you from your perspective? Do readers of Svenska Dagbladet care about human rights, or would they think, no, put the economy first?
I think that, a cynic's answer would be that there's a bit of cherry picking in which human rights we really care for, isn't it? Do we sell weapons to a certain country, then maybe we don't care too much to bang on about the human rights in that country. I'm from Sweden, it's a big weapon exporting country, so I don't need to talk about any other country. And then we do care about human rights maybe in countries that we are not as economically interested in. But the EU as a group, I think, is actually quite good at trying to at least, introduce paragraphs on human rights in trade deals or in any other kinds of deals. So as a group, they work better than I say separately.
Okay. Well, one organisation, of course, that's been banging the drum for years and putting pressure on the EU to promote human rights ahead of business and political considerations is the NGO Amnesty International. And our Paul Lara Copano had the opportunity to speak to Hussein Baoumi from Amnesty International here in Brussels to ask him what's at stake and what he thinks about EU relations with countries like Egypt, Israel and Qatar. Take a listen.
What worries me the most in the near future is that we will see a continuation of business as usual. So on the one hand, we see European Union leaders claiming that they want to promote human rights, claiming that they care about human rights, claiming that human rights is a key aspect of their engagement with countries outside the European Union, while at the same time we see them as giving great carpets to leaders who have been responsible for massive human rights violations, for war crimes. So what worries me the most is the continuation of this, which results in a loss of confidence in European Union's leaders from people that don't live in the European Union.
Hussein Baoumi there from Amnesty International, describing the fact that this is creating a lack of confidence even in the European Union project itself. Teresa, what would you say to that?
I think what diplomats, countries, governments also do, and it's hard to explain to the voter sometimes, is that they say, we condemn the crimes committed by this and that country, but still we keep the diplomatic doors open. We keep the doors open, we keep the connections open. And that's sometimes hard to, I think there's a knee-jerk reaction to, that country is violating human rights. Let's throw it out of the Olympic Games, or let's throw it out of all our diplomatic gatherings. And I think to the bitter end, they always try to keep the doors open, because once you've shut the door, then how are you going to persuade that particular country to do better? That's a little bit the theme, whether you agree with it or not. But it's hard to explain to voters why we just don't cut our ties with all these countries.
And that's the situation that you're probably often in as an elected member of the European Parliament, explaining these issues to your voters when they're standing there screaming at you, going, why is this happening? What do you say to them?
Well, there are different grades of human rights violations. Let's agree to that at least. And I think that what makes it very important is that we react on time and we don't allow for certain development to take place, because we always know we have these signals prior to major crackdowns on human rights that this development is going that way, and that's why our reaction that is timely is very, very important, because I think we need to be very clear on our signals when discussing with these countries. I understand the will of the diplomats to keep the doors open, but not in all cases. Sometimes it goes beyond my understanding. We know that in certain countries we don't even have so much of economic ties or any diplomatic ties, and we still continue, because I think that the diplomatic corps isn't conservative one that always works in certain ways, and it likes to keep this, the same methods ongoing because it doesn't want to change. But we are living actually in a small village because Instagram, TikTok, Facebook is bringing the world to our not only homes, but very, very intimate space, and we cannot shut it down. So many people, they are following developments, the situation in different countries from other peers that are in the same situation. Maybe they have the same age, the same kind of job, and where they are connected, and they see the situation from their eyes, not from a political or diplomatic eyes. And that's why we cannot keep doing what we are doing. We cannot keep on fighting for
business as usual,
and not fighting for human rights the way we have been doing.
And your photo went viral last October in the European Parliament. I'll tell our viewers in a minute why, but first, Elizabeth, I'd like to get your perspective on whether or not the EU, you think, would be struggling financially if it didn't put its economic interests first.
Well, I don't think so. I think, also building on what you said, I think the EU underestimates often what it can do. I think there's much more that the EU can do beyond just economic and financial support. Clearly, the EU should put pressure on international actors and work via them, such as the UN, but also ensure that, for example, in the countries concerned, and we saw a few quite telling examples, that the EU supports civil society, that also from within there's actors that need support protest movements. I think that's very important as well.
And on that note of protests, of course, protests are still taking place in Iran. We saw protests here in the EU quarter of Brussels as well this week as foreign affairs ministers were meeting to introduce new sanctions on the Iranian regime. And of course, yourself, Abir, we spoke earlier about that time you went viral. You went viral because you spoke at the European Parliament plenary session in Strasbourg back in early October, and you cut your hair. Can you tell us about that moment and if you feel that moment then has changed anything?
Well, I mean, this is what I was talking about, that the diplomatic corps is a conservative one and that likes to uphold the same methods of working. And I mean, it was a week after the UN General Assembly where nobody spoke about the protesters of women in Iran. At that time, the protest was driven only by women, solely or mainly, and Mahsa Amini's body has not been called yet. I mean, it was so directly after what happened. And the UN General Assembly, it was, I think, only Justin Trudeau who actually spoke about Iran, and UN Women didn't even post anything on their social media about the women in Iran for a whole week during the General Assembly. And I came to the plenary, and there was Mr. Joseph Borrell, who was just mumbling yet another press release. I mean, the old just traditional, men mumbling. I was so tired of it, and I was so frustrated, and I was so angry, because here you have women who had no guns. They have nothing to defend themselves beside the voices they had. And the EU could not even respond with a proper, solidarity, with a proper voice saying, we are on your side. He was just, we will take into consideration and took out. And that is not good enough.
Teresa, your reaction?
No, about the mumbling, yes, he does mumble.
Joseph Borrell.
He mumbles a lot. He does, actually. Enunciation should be taught in his office. I sometimes wonder why doesn't anyone criticise Iran? Let's just generalise a little. We haven't seen a single European country. We haven't seen Olaf Scholz hold a passionate speech about the women's rights in Iran. We haven't seen Macron. We haven't seen Ulf Kristersson, the Swedish Prime Minister. We haven't seen. Instead, we've seen people like you in the Parliament. We've seen maybe Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, has made a statement as well. And I'm wondering if it's very, very practical for a lot of big countries who have economic interest in Iran to just, we let Borrell mumble about it in our name for us, and therefore we don't have to take the diplomatic fight with Iran.
If we go back a couple of years, Catherine Ashton, the lady who had the role of Joseph Borrell many years ago, and of course Federica Mogherini, the Italian lady who was head of the EU's External Action Service, they were working with building up relations with Iran carefully, of course, for that nuclear deal. So there's a lot at stake here, of course, as well for the EU.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that there may be fear that indeed this is an Iranian-led movement and change should come from within. I think history teaches us, especially I think in the case of Iran, that indeed meddling into Iranian national affairs doesn't always pay off. So perhaps there is that fear as well on top of the economic consequences. But I think, and especially as a woman, I really would like to acknowledge the power of female anger and engagement in Iran. And I think we should support it. And as we just discussed, there is much more that the EU can do. Again, economic sanctions. There's now, I believe, a meeting of EU foreign affairs ministers, a meeting where indeed on individuals within the regime, for example, the sports minister who was involved in the case of the Iranian athlete, he is going to be on the list. There is visa sanctions, etc. There's a lot that the EU can do.
And just on the calls as well on the European Union to call the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist group. We reported about it earlier here on Euronews. And the European Parliament also passed a resolution asking for this to happen. The European Commission President as well, Ursula von der Leyen, seems to be in favour. Germany, France and the Netherlands too. But it seems that the directive needs to come from a court, from an EU member. That's what Josep Borrell said. Is that true? Do you have any information on that? And why can't the EU go further?
Well, I mean, the Council could go either way. They have a review of the list that they of over terrorists that they do every 6 months, and that review is ongoing. And there they can actually choose if there is political will without waiting for the court decision. But also there is this proper way that where you don't need the political will to have a court decision that will be made for you and therefore put the political pressure on you. I mean, it is very clear, the signals are very clear. The Iranians have been presenting the evidence about why the IRGC should be put on the terrorist list. But them dragging their feet behind them at the Council, I really fail to understand. I'm trying my best, but I do fail to understand what, I mean, you can say economic reasons, you can say all of that, but still, children are being killed on the streets. Girls who are not being sexually active yet are being raped before execution so they don't get into paradise, according to the mullah's rhetorics. Women, men are losing their lives on the streets. And no, I don't understand. So.
Okay. And what's even... Elizabeth?
I mean, it seems another case of indeed Borrell not choosing his words carefully, because von der Leyen already said that indeed Commission would be in favour. So clearly there's ways to make this happen. It seems a question of political will. And it seems also a question of taking away the business of indeed the movement from within. And I think therefore that would be a really important signal.
Okay, we'll have to wait and see what happens on Iran. But zooming out of Iran and looking at the picture across the globe, the European Parliament presented its annual report this week on the state of human rights and democracy worldwide. We can show you some of the findings in that report. It said that less than half of the world's population now live in a democracy of some sort, and more than 37% live under authoritarian rule. It said the energy crisis is fueling poverty and human rights setbacks as well across the world. And it says the COVID pandemic as well has had a detrimental impact on human rights as well. That's a pretty grim reading, Teresa. I don't know if you've read the report. It's pretty comprehensive, pretty lengthy. I've just given you 3 examples of what's been written there, but...
I haven't read the report, but what I would look for in it as a European affairs correspondent, I would see, I would look at which of the European Union countries they were risking, you know, driving off into non-democratic areas. For instance, we know that we have an ongoing dispute with Hungary and Poland, because the European Union cannot, as a group, point finger at a dictator at some other part of the world and said, you know, we're not going to trade with you until you change your manners. If we have inside our own union questionable elements, questionable countries in the area of democracy.
And Elizabeth, a question for you, and of course for yourself as an MEP, will the corruption scandal that the Parliament is embroiled in right now, will that change anything, you think?
Well, I hope so. I clearly, on top of indeed looking into data and having a clear picture of who is involved and what interests are at stake, clearly I think when it comes to the Parliament and also broader, we need to look into what rules do we have in place. I think more transparency, I think in general, is very important, but especially in the case of the Qatargate, more transparency, not just applying to the Parliament, but for all 3 institutions, I think is very important.
And from yourself, Abir, briefly?
Well, I mean, I'll just back a little bit to the report, and it showcases something that I have been reflecting on. It is the lack of global leadership when it comes to standing up for human rights, freedom, and rule of law and democracy. We don't have any global leader who is, you know, very clear who can stand up. And with the withdrawal of the United States of America and the crippled UN that is not taking its duties seriously and not acting upon them because it's crippled with the conflicts inside because of bureaucracy and all of that, the EU has a very fundamental, important role to play. And if we don't have clean house inside, it will be very difficult to also play that global role where we are very, very much needed.
Okay. Let's see, can someone step up to the plate? I'm going to have to stop you all there because that's all we have time for on this topic. But don't go anywhere. More coming up on Euronews and Euronews.com. Welcome back to Bruxelles, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a look back at some of the big European stories of the week. Now, one story that has had us hooked, not just this week, but all month, was that of the French President Emmanuel Macron's attempts to increase the retirement age in France from 62 to 64. 2 million people went on the streets of France recently to protest against these reforms. I would like to hear the reaction from the panel on this.
The pension in France is like, you know, every country has that one issue that the voters going to test their leaders on. Me, it's like, do you know what a litre of milk costs? Or you don't even know the price of a baguette? Or you don't know. Blah. The pension is the French kind of, since the French Revolution, that has been the symbol of where this country is going up, down. Other countries could say, you know, oh, it's parental leave, the kind of marks us on the global map or whatever. In France, it's the pension. I think Macron is up against a wall here.
He's up against a wall, and it's called, of course, the French model. Elizabeth?
Well, I think the French seem to suffer from Mitterrand nostalgia because, as you say, for ages it's been an issue. Mitterrand decreased pension age to age 60. And although we have seen that over the last 30 years, the majority of EU countries have reformed the pension system for good reasons, because we have an aging population, we have really pressure on public expenditure, so there's a need to reform the system. But still, it's such a toxic issue, as we have seen again this week.
Well, let's take a look at Abir here, because, of course, you're patting Macron on the back. Your party is affiliated with his party.
Not only because of that, because it's on the long term is the only responsible policy that you can have for the country. If you don't care about France, then you should ask for a lower pension. But if you care, if you love France, if you want to have a sustainable economic situation, do not listen to the left populist nor to the far right populists.
Talking about the far right and the far left.
Yeah,
but the majority
the narrative is upheld by them. The narrative is upheld by them. Every person understands that you cannot have lower birth rate, but higher living rate. I mean, people are getting older and older, and expect to have the same pension age. I mean, this is totally mathematically, it's not doable. And if it's not mathematically doable, then you can not have it in economics. So my message to the French, the people of France would be, if you love your country, then you have to actually do something about your pension system, because it's not sustainable.
But best of luck if you have to be the messenger to bring that message to those protesters. They looked very...
You need a good PR
very angry.
Right.
Not only that, but I mean, you need actually to make people understand that it is about the future of the country.
And also the reason why I call it toxic is that it's focusing so much or mainly on the age. And I think it completely overlooks certain specific elements that we need to focus on, such as a gender gap. Exactly. Because, for example, the gender gap in wages is lower than the gender gap in pension. So it means that a lot of women receive a very low pension. For example, when it comes to the labor market changes, we need to really look at the flexibilities of the system.
Let's take a look at what the picture is across the continent, not just in France. Coming up on your screens there, you can see that in Germany, the legal early retirement age is 63.7. In Poland, for men, it's 65, and for women, it's 60. And in France, 62 for both men and women. And in Lithuania, 59 for men and 58 for women. Your reaction to that, Teresa?
No, I want to react on the Polish 65 for men and 60 for women. I feel almost offended. Is it a pat on my head, like, you little woman, you should go rest, like you're not fit to work longer? That's how I interpret that. I'm sure it is, and I'm sure it has to do with who looks after the kids in Poland. But as a spontaneous reaction, and older people. But I was very offended by that. Like, as a woman, am I weaker? I can't work any longer. No, the Swedish age is 65. In Sweden, the debate has been the opposite. Couple of years. There are people who want to work until 67, and they can if they want to. Certain exceptions, but I've never seen any anyone wanted to work shorter.
But I'd like to ask the Swedes around the table, do you know the economist Carl Gustav Scherman? Yeah? Does he ring a bell? So he has thrown a bit of fire into the whole debate in France by speaking to French media and telling them not to copy the Swedish model. He was a man responsible 20 years ago for increasing that retirement age over in Sweden. And now he's after jumping right into the French debate about it and told them not to. Why do you think he did that?
The main reason is the gender gap that is in pensions, especially for women who were born back in the 30s, 40s, who had to stay at home, because the Swedish pension system is built upon how high income you have generated via work, not by staying at home. And many women from that generation had to stay at home to take care of the children and then also work part-time for a longer period of time so they can be available at home when the kids come back from school, while the men did not have to do that. Thus, they have higher pensions. But, I mean, the government tried, like my party was part of that agreement where we tried to put extra money into the women's pensions and lower also the taxing for that specific group. So we work much more targeted towards people who are underprivileged via the pension system. But these mistakes France do not need to do. I mean, they can work on the pay gap during working, and they can actually, just an idea, I don't know, to build up their welfare system for like childcare, so women can actually have the possibility to leave their children in a safe and not so expensive childcare, so they can go and work and that in that way generate pensions.
Now, Elizabeth, these protests look like they will continue. How are they being perceived here in political circles in Brussels?
Well, I think that a lot of countries are indeed looking this with almost surprise because, again, in the majority of EU countries, reforms already have been underway. And I think the French do not seem to realize that, again, there is a competition when it comes to public expenditure. So the question really is, do you want to maintain a good healthcare system or a good education system or indeed good childcare? Or do you want to stick to that retirement age? And again, it's such a black and white vision because, as we said, I think that's also the work-life balance directive. So let's not only think about, okay, we can work longer, we need to work longer, but let's do that in a qualitative way so that we have indeed more quality of life, even though we're older. And in that respect, I think that is not that focus yet.
Teresa Coucher, you've been following French politics for decades. Do you think Emmanuel Macron, the French president, will survive this?
No, I don't think again, it's not about reasoning. You put forward so many good arguments, they should do this, and because of these numbers, then the women and the this and that. It's not, this is a symbolic fight. And Macron needs, a fantastic PR strategist. He needs to phrase it differently. But it's like if I said in the UK, we're going to bring back Charles Dickens times and have children work in the coal mines. That's what it sounds like for a French person to raise.
Teresa Coucher, I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And Elizabeth and Abir, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your insights. And thank you for watching. We'll see you soon here on Euronews and Euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a little look back at some of the European stories that caught our eye this week. Now, one story that stood out to us here at Euronews was the bulletin of atomic scientists moving its doomsday clock forward by 10 seconds, warning that humanity was now, quote, the closest to global catastrophe it has ever been. Their logic behind this, largely, but not exclusively, because of the mounting dangers of the war in Ukraine. So, ladies, have you seen that this week? What do you think about it? Pretty gloomy image there. Elizabeth, have you seen it?
I hadn't seen it, but it's true that I think we all know that feeling that perhaps, 20 years ago, we all felt that we were having upward convergence, everything got a little bit better, there was a little bit more trade, wages went a little bit up for everyone. And it's true that also personally, and when we discuss with friends and family, I think we all have that feeling like, well, the world is not a great place. So in that respect, I haven't seen it, but I can relate to it.
And what about yourself, Abir? Have you seen it?
No, luckily I have not seen it. Of course, I listen to scientists, and I mean, we fight for finding solution for climate change every day in the European Parliament. It's a very highly prioritized issue, but at the same time, I know that more people are living above the poverty line. More people are gaining more freedoms, and I like to stick to the optimistic side of the story.
Teresa Kushner, did you see it?
Yeah, I saw it, and I have to agree with Abir. I was responsible for taking questions from readers at the beginning of the war, and I was very surprised by one thing. People were very, very scared. They weren't asking complicated questions about weaponry or politics. They were saying, will I die? Is this the moment where I should look for shelter? And I don't know if scaring people is the right
That's
way.
the thing, is that not creating fear
I
there?
think
I mean,
it might be,
honestly,
actually.
I think they're trying to just give a wake-up call there to politicians to make them aware of what's at stake. Just to end perhaps on a more lighter note, if, ladies, the world was about to end this weekend, what would you do? Elizabeth?
Make the travels that I couldn't do so far.
Okay. And yourself, Abir?
Oh my God, hug my children and my parents.
Oh, yes.
Teresa Kushner, what?
Well, after I've hugged my family, I think I'd just get a bottle of wine and listen to opera.
Listen to opera. Well, the world is not going to end. We're still very much here. And I think that message is just a wake-up call to politicians. I mean, what would your message be, Elizabeth Cooper, to politicians working here at the heart of the European Union in this very polarised world that we're living in, with European elections coming up in just a year and a half?
Well, act now. And act sincerely, because I think today's world is so much dominated by populism, by very short-termism, and I think it's really important to act with genuine values that we indeed defend for the EU, but also for the global world really we're living in today.
And we're hearing that a lot lately from heads of the EU institution, is that it's been a wake-up call. A lot has been a wake-up call. It's like finally they've woken up after like 10 years of sleeping, perhaps. Have you noticed that?
Well, I mean, when you're inside the politics, you understand that you cannot have these politicians who answer with 160 signs. You know, we are not Twitter. And if I would make a wish is, you know, put the effort and time as a politician to actually give the more difficult answer, you know, treat your voters with that kind of dignity and respect and give them a whole answer that is more than a tweet, and stop being part of the polarization, because on the long term, no one will win anything out of it. But
and even though the truth might hurt, like the truth, if you were to go and meet those protesters in France, that might hurt, right, Teresa?
I think what the EU should do is get the Fit for 55 package in place, the climate package.
Can you just remind our viewers what?
Yeah, it's the climate package. There's a big, huge pile of laws and regulations about, you know, how to fix the climate. And once that's written in stone, signed and sent off, I think, you know, things can move. But as long as they're stalling it and discussing and blaming something,
many people
to stall
joke here
it.
that the Fit for 55 package is like something like a gym workout. But indeed,
Yes.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, ladies. But thank you so much, and enjoy your weekend. The world is not going to end. Thank you so much for being with us here on Euronews, and thank you for watching. We'll see you soon here on Euronews and Euronews.com.